Good morning. We are studying the period between the Testaments, of course. And I was just thinking today I have to keep reminding myself that the quarter doesn't end at the end of the year. It ends at the end of this month. Is that right? That is right, isn't it? For some reason, I get in my mind that the quarter ends in December, and then I have to go, no. So I can't dilly-dally too much. By the way, I do still have several of the chronology if you don't have that or need an extra copy. I look at this from time to time. I just leave my extras here, but I look at it from time to time just to make sure I'm covering the significant events that are on that. And I think we have so far. We're up around, of course, you see, if you have that, you may not have it exactly in front of you, but around 334, 323 BC, Alexander the Great conquers the East. And then when you get to about 311 BC is the next thing mentioned, the next date mentioned. Seleucus conquers Babylon, and the Seleucid dynasty begins. That's about where we left off. We were covering some of these things last week, and I was telling somebody that it was, I don't know, it's been, now it's been 2, 3, 4 weeks ago when we were going through, I don't remember which particular lesson it was, but one of them I went a little too in depth, I guess. Sometimes I get carried away because I enjoy the history of it, and I wish we had more time sometimes just to dive into and get some more of the details, but in one of those lessons, I guess I got too detailed and I got behind. I got off my schedule. So, man, when you do, it's hard to make up time, especially in a study like this, because there are sometimes things I feel like I cannot leave that out. And so I've been scrambling ever since trying to catch us up. So hopefully we can catch up a little bit more today. And even if we catch up little bits at a time, I can live with that. I also saw something, it was ironic just this last week, and it really impacted me just as a teacher who's trying to stand before an audience, 2, 3, often more times than that a week if you count online stuff and things like that. But as a teacher, I read something, and I can't remember where this was from as far as source or anything, or I'd give credit. But I think it's very true, and it like I said, it impacted me, and I thought I've got to really keep this in mind, especially in a study like this where you can get really, really in-depth and technical and, lost in some of the details. But the quote was something, I'm paraphrasing because I don't have it in front of me, but it was something to the effect of, if you can't take something and explain it in very simple, concise terms, you don't really understand it yourself. And I thought, wow, that is a very short statement, but it's powerful. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There are some things that are, we sometimes say it's not rocket science. Well, I suppose it would be hard to explain rocket science very short and concise. So we understand there are some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, that's a pretty true statement. So I thought, okay, Chad, I'm going to try to get down to the brass tacks on some of this. And I don't want to get lost in the details, even though I enjoy some of the details. I know some of you all do as well, but that'll help us hopefully make up some time. So we kind of left off talking about the aftermath of Alexander's empire. It was about 11 years after he crossed, not the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, began his kind of world conquest. It was amazingly fast, but also amazingly short. Within 11 years of that, Alexander is dead. Natural causes, ironically, although there was some unrest growing in his empire and people were getting kind of tired of Alexander, he was, we called him, based on Charles Pfeiffer's statement in his book, the Apostle of Hellenism, but he really started to kind of erode some of that toward the latter part of that 11 years, and it was wearing thin on a lot of people in his empire, encouraging soldiers to intermingle with the Persians and things like that. Some of them didn't like that. But when Alexander died, there were 4 generals that kind of his territory fell to. Antigonus, Cassander, Ptolemy, Lysimachus. And sometimes people will list Seleucus as one of the four people to whom the empire was divided. Now, I pointed this out last week, but I'll just remind you because I ran across a couple of different sources. I think one was from a member of the church who had put together a study on intertestamental period, and I don't remember where the other one was, but sometimes people will say that, and I guess if you want to sum it up and say it fell out that way eventually, that's true, but Seleucus was not one of those four generals of Alexander. Seleucus was a general, if you want to use that term, of Ptolemy. And so what happened was Antigonus basically envisioned himself as he's going to be the next Alexander. And so he starts conquering. The others just kind of, I think I said this last week, that they didn't sit down at a table and go, okay, you take Egypt, you take Syria, this is what you're going to take. This is kind of how it all fell out due to fighting. But Antigonus originally kind of thinks, I'm going to be, and he had a lot of power, military strength. So Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus get together. They combine forces. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. They combine forces. They go against Antigonus, and they defeat him. Now, Ptolemy was in on that alliance, but he really didn't get in on the fighting. And so when they get together after they defeat Antigonus, the three decide, well, you know what? Here's who was involved in the fighting. Lysimachus, Cassander, and Seleucus. So how about we just divide the land between us? So they split up the land, and Seleucus ends up with an area that would include Palestine. And that's kind of the big picture here. When it all fell out, Seleucus ends up getting a designation that's called Syria. And by the way, when we use this term, the Seleucid dynasty, the Seleucids, it's kind of synonymous with Syria. But that sometimes included a larger area, sometimes a smaller area, depending on what? Depending on who won the latest battle, right? I mean, it was just nonstop. This period in history, at least in that area of the world, it really is quite surprising in one sense. In one sense, it's not surprising because you know how humans can be. But it's amazing how often, I mean, it's just, if you ever study the Vietnam conflict, it's amazing to watch how often sometimes a piece of ground be taken and then they just surrender it right back. Now, a lot of that was politics, but there was a lot of that back and forth, and that's kind of how this was, except it wasn't somebody up top saying, hey, we're going to retreat back a little bit. It was a fight over that, and sometimes the territory you own today, you fight a battle tomorrow, as it were, and sometimes literally within a day or so, you fight another battle, and you've surrendered that territory. So that's kind of what happened, and after that alliance, and they decided they were going to divide it up between them three, while they're meeting and hashing out all the details of the land, Ptolemy just moves into that area, which included Palestine, and he just begins ruling it. And then Seleucus comes along and he's like, hey, this is my territory. And Ptolemy's, sometimes we use the old expression, possession is, what's the expression? Possession's 9/10 of the law, right? You ever heard somebody use that expression? That's kind of what Ptolemy says. And so he and Seleucus, they were friends. Again, Seleucus was one of his generals at one time at least. And Seleucus kind of basically says to him, we're going to let this go for now, but this ain't over, sort of the way he puts it. For the sake of our friendship, I'm just going to let you stay here for right now. But what that kind of was the beginning of was a long time. I'm talking right at a century of conflict between the Ptolemies, who ruled more in Egypt, and the Seleucids, who were up, just north and a little east of there. I don't know. I don't know if I still got that map in the PowerPoint drop folder or not. But I showed you that map last week, and you probably have a map in the back of your Bible that would at least show that. Let's see. I've got one just looking at the world of the patriarchs, and I can at least, see that area, so you get an idea. But Egypt going on up into, it's kind of east and then up north into the Canaan area and what we call Palestine. So what would happen, of course, is Seleucus wants to expand his area, and so he tries to conquer down into Egypt. It's not always Seleucus. Now, again, they kind of made peace, Seleucus and Ptolemy, but then their descendants, whoever takes over for one or the other, for decades, is just back and forth. I'm going to go down here and I'm going to take Egypt away because it rightfully belonged to my father anyways, and that old Ptolemy didn't participate in the fighting to stave off Antigonus, so I'm going down there. It belongs to us, and we're going to take it. And sometimes they would make incursions even on down into Egypt a little bit, only then to surrender them, because then somebody down in Egypt, one of the Ptolemies, is going to say, well, they just go and think they could just take this away, and they probably had the attitude something like, well, Seleucus was just a general under my great-great-granddad anyways, and so, who does he think he is? He had no right to that to begin with. And so it's just constant back and forth. And, of course, as we mentioned, it's sort of like, if it's like a tug of war, only instead of a rope, you've got a nation that is in between. And sometimes they're caught in between. Troops are marching through. Sometimes it's troops marching back, and they're really angry, frustrated because they got beat. Sometimes it's troops marching back. They might even be victorious, but they're sometimes they're celebrating and decide they're going to just celebrate. And if you don't like the way we celebrate, tough, and they'll take it out on you. But more often than not, it was Palestine being caught in between, and a lot of times it was somebody who's upset because they got beat or got defeated somehow, turned back, and so now they're come back and they're angry, and they take it out many times on Palestine. So that's kind of the big picture of what's going on. And as far as under the Ptolemies, when the Jews were living under Ptolemaic rule, there was a fellow whose name was Simon the Just. He was a high priest during that time. Pfeiffer points out he's the subject of the highest praise in post-biblical writings. Ecclesiasticus calls him great among his brethren and the glory of his people. He's credited with rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, which had been demolished by Ptolemy I. He is said to have repaired the temple and directed the excavation of a great freshwater reservoir. And along with his office as high priest and head of the community, he was reputed to be the chief teacher of the people. And Pfeiffer quotes him as having a favorite maxim: the world rests on three things: the law, divine service, and on charity. And so that was Simon the Just. And during this time, there was another fellow that came along. There was this house of Onios I, who was also a high priest somewhere during this Ptolemaic rule. And there's not a whole lot known about Onios I, but that's just to say that the house of Onias and the house of Tobias, they were going to become bitter rivals. And it's somewhere during this time period that the office of high priest goes from, of course, biblically, what is the office of high priest? It's spiritual leader of the nation. He's the only one who could enter into the most holy place. And even that only one time a year, one day out of the year, to offer for himself, to offer for the people. And did they vote yearly, biannually, each decade for a new high priest? It's a descendant of Aaron. And God told Eli he was going to judge his house because Eli didn't discipline his children. And so sometimes God would make changes to the priesthood directly, but it's always a descendant of Aaron. And it's always the tribe of Levi, because that was the only tribe priests could come from under the law of Moses, right? But it's during this time that you're going to see that's going to change. It's going to become more about who can flex the most muscle, figuratively and sometimes otherwise. But sometimes it's a political thing, and you're going to see that happen during this time period. And so the house of Onias, house of Tobias, they become rivals, and it's all about getting a hold of the high priesthood. The house of Tobias was a pro-Egyptian. They were in favor of the Ptolemies, in other words. They represented the wealthy class of Jerusalem society. And there's speculation, not for sure, but there's speculation that it seems certainly plausible that Tobias was related to Tobiah the Ammonite. And where do we read about him? Nehemiah, especially in Nehemiah. Was he a friend of Nehemiah? No, quite the opposite, right? He was always troubling the work as they try to rebuild the walls. And so the Tobiads were thought to have been tax collectors, which means they would have occupied the same function as publicans of New Testament times. Not the same, but similar type of work at least. So when you go to the historian Josephus, we learn about Onias. Onias II refused to pay the Ptolemy in Egypt his 20 talents of silver. It was some kind of a tribute tax that was demanded of the high priest. He didn't pay it. Well, when you don't pay it, that's viewed as rebellion. You're not paying your taxes. In fact, this is what happens sometimes with going back all the way back into Old Testament times, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Sometimes they would come in, and that's why there were 3 carryings away into captivity of the southern kingdom. On the first time, Nebuchadnezzar comes in and he says, hey, I'm Nebuchadnezzar, I'm with Babylon, we're in charge now. Pay your taxes, be nice, and we'll leave it at that. He did take some captives just to kind of flex his muscle, but that's, I'm going to leave you alone. But what would happen is some king would decide, of course, ironically, instead of asking God for help against a pagan ruler, they'd decide, hey, we need to go over here and talk to Egypt. Or when Assyria was still in power. Of course, Assyria is declining. And they'd sometimes say to Assyria, hey, we'll give you some gold if you'll come over here and help us. And so then they would not pay their taxes to Nebuchadnezzar, and of course then he's going to come. Well, that's what happened with Onias here in the Ptolemy. The Ptolemy viewed it as you've renounced allegiance to Egypt, basically. And so then this other fellow, Joseph, who was a Tobiad, again, those houses, Onias and Tobias, are going to have constant friction. So Joseph, this Tobiad, succeeded in having himself appointed as the tax collector, basically, for all of Palestine. And so the tax farmer or tax collector would go to Alexandria every year, and he would bid for renewal of the license to be the tax gatherer. This man, Joseph, this Tobiad, he held this post for about 20 years under the Ptolemies, and even on into when the Seleucids took over that area. So, it just, that kind of set the stage for a lot of back and forth friction between the house of Onias and the house of Tobias over the high priesthood. So the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, they're fighting it out politically, a lot of back and forth, but right there in Palestine, there's this battle over the high priesthood. And again, the high priesthood goes from this inherited descendant of Aaron, and it's going to become more of a political thing. And that's going to get worse and worse, of course, as we go on through this history. And by the way, that reminds me, I need to correct something I said last week. It's not a big deal, and you may have caught this, but I was looking back over my notes, and I realized I said it wrong, and I just wanted to make sure we were talking about the Ptolemies. They attacked the Jews on the Sabbath, knowing that the Jews wouldn't defend themselves. And I think I said that Josephus wrote something kind of mocking the Jews for this, like they were too strict in interpreting the law about the Sabbath. It wasn't Josephus that said that. Josephus gave the account, but he's quoting from someone else who basically was saying, man, paraphrasing to put it in modern day terminology, the guy basically was saying, these bunch of religious nuts, they won't even defend themselves just because it's the Sabbath day. That's kind of what he was saying. But Josephus just quotes the guy. He didn't say that. And so I said last week that Josephus said that, but I just want to make sure I corrected that. All right, so Whew. Let's talk about the war breaking out between the Seleucids and Ptolemies, and then we'll talk about the Jewish nation under the Seleucids. Basically, a war broke out between those. Remember, Seleucus, he basically said, for the sake of our friendship, we're just going to let this go for now, and you can go ahead and have your Egyptian area. I'll stay in Syria, and it's going to be just sort of not happy about it, but we're not going to just outright fight about it. Well, there was some friction there, but basically there was a lady that there had been a marriage. Ptolemy's daughter, Berenice, was betrothed to Antiochus II. Now, Antiochus, you may recognize that name, was a descendant of Seleucus, in that line of the rulers of the Seleucid dynasty. And Antiochus built a city. Can you guess what he called it? Antioch. In fact, there are two Antiochs that we read about in the New Testament, and that's why. Sometimes these rulers build a city and name it after themselves, and sometimes there'd be another city and they just name that one same after themselves. So there's Antioch in Pisidia, there's Antioch in Syria. But this one, of course, that we're talking about here is Antioch in Syria. So that's they're going to have a marriage between one of the Ptolemies, one of the Seleucids, and that's going to bring finally all this friction, and we're all going to play nice. But the problem was Berenice and her infant son had been murdered. There was the plotting of this lady, this half sister and wife of Antiochus II, whose name was Laodice, if that's how I'm pronouncing it. She wanted to ensure her own son would succeed on the Syrian throne. And so, of course, when she murders Berenice and her infant son, reckon how the Ptolemies feel about that. Do you think they're real happy about that? They're not happy about it. And so that resulted in what is called the Laodicean War. And that's when things got really, really nasty between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And so Seleucus, he regains lost territories, but there's a lot of back and forth. But all that just to say this, Seleucus II was succeeded by his younger brother, who was known as Antiochus III, who we know in history as Antiochus the Great. And that brings us kind of talking about the Jews under the Seleucid rule. Antiochus III, there was so much more we could say about him, but he was only 18 years old when he came to the throne of Syria. Again, he's often referred to as Antiochus the Great, so when you see that in history or in intertestamental history, Bible history, whatever, you'll know that's, and this is a different guy than Antiochus Epiphanes. We'll get to him in just a moment, because that was Antiochus Epiphanes is actually Antiochus IV, the son of this man, Antiochus the Great. He came to rule at a very young age, but he'd had experience in government. He served under his brother, Seleucus III, as ruler of Babylonia. He wanted to, this Antiochus the Great, he wanted to invade the Palestinian area. He wanted to make sure he got control of that. And so he did, but just kind of summing up a lot of history. In fact, I was looking for it. I was just going to jump down to try to get to the main thing, because I've got so much more I could say, and I've just got to make up the time. Oh, there was a Carthaginian, Hannibal. If you ever study world history, you studied about Hannibal. Hannibal and his elephants. You remember that from world history, hopefully. Well, Hannibal was defeated. Does anybody remember who defeated Hannibal? An up-and-coming group of folks known as the Romans. They were up and coming, but soon they would sweep across that part of the world. I mean, it was amazing how Rome rose to power. But Rome fought Hannibal, and this was what we call, if you study history, what are these wars called? Carthage and Rome fighting back and forth. There was not just one. In fact, in history we call it plural, the what wars? The Punic Wars. Well, in the Second Punic War, Hannibal was defeated by the Romans. This was around 202 BC. That ended the Second Punic War. So here's the thing, though. Hannibal, he flees eastward. He takes refuge in the court of none other than Antiochus the Great. So he's kind of running for his life, holds up there with Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III. But you reckon he's a big fan of Rome at this point? No, he just went to war with him, and he got whooped. And so he's not only doesn't like him, now he's kind of been humbled by him. So he's interested in stirring up trouble for Rome. And what he does is he encourages Antiochus, you know what you should do? You should be a conqueror, and you should go and invade Greece. And you could conquer Greece, and just think how your territory would expand, and you'd have, the Grecian money, and there's all that culture over there. You should invade Greece. And so he talks him into it, I don't know if he talked him into it, but he encouraged it at least. So Antiochus the Great, a lot of times these world leaders don't take a lot of encouraging to invade somebody, right? So guess what? He goes and moves into Greece. And who has a problem with that? Rome. Rome forthwith declares war now on Antiochus the Great. You're not taking Greece. Of course, Rome they're still kind of up and comers, but they're strong enough, and they realize that they don't want somebody else becoming so strong that they're going to end Rome's up and coming rise to power. So Rome declares war, and they go to battle with Antiochus the Great, and this Roman general Cornelius Scipio, he defeats Antiochus. This is around 190 BC, and all that is to say this: Antiochus the Great, he was thoroughly whipped in this battle, and he had to pay a huge, the word that Pfeiffer uses is indemnity. And here was his conditions of surrender. He had to surrender his war elephants. That was a big deal. He had to surrender his navy. That might have even been a bigger deal. But not only that, he had to send his younger son as a prisoner to Rome. Now, I've never read in history if there was any stipulated amount of time, or Bob, have you read? I know you've studied this period of history pretty. I've never been able to find anything that indicates did he escape, because he doesn't die in Roman captivity, this younger son. I don't know did he escape? Was there some diplomatic discussion that maybe got him released? That's kind of been my impression from reading, but I've never found any historian who comes out and says, at least that I can recall, one way or the other. Have you?
I think he just goes there and he learns, he watches, and he has gained respect for the Romans.
Yeah, but as far as why he got to come home, I don't know. Typically in a situation like that, it would be hard to imagine them just saying, well, you've served 2 years, take off. Good having you here. That's just not how that typically works. So my guess would be diplomatic relations. Some kind of diplomacy got him released. But all this is to point out Antiochus the Great, he's utterly defeated by the Romans. He surrenders his navy, his elephants, and his son goes to Rome as a captive. That son was Antiochus IV, who we know as Antiochus Epiphanes. He goes to Rome, he spends some time there, and he's a captive, but Rome is still, they treat him like a royal captive. And so he's not just, in a dark dungeon with no light and bread and water and nothing else to eat or, whatever. But he goes there and he learns a lot. He learns, in fact, to respect Rome. He learns a lot about the Roman way of doing things. And he also learns that, Rome ain't no joke. They're pretty powerful. And that's going to come into play later on. So that's what happens that kind of humbled Antiochus the Great. Palestine fell into Syrian hands, of course, following this victory of Antiochus the Great at a place called Panion. This was in 198 BC. That ushered in a new era of Jewish history. The rule of the Ptolemies, they'd been pretty tolerant with the Jews. You want to have your Jewish religion, your Judaism, whatever. Pay your taxes, we don't care. But the Seleucids, not so. What did the Seleucids want? They wanted your taxes, yes. You're still going to pay your taxes. But they want you to be Hellenistic, which means, what's that synonymous with? Greek, the Grecian culture. And again, that's just a term that's used. They wanted to Hellenize the world. And that's the irony of Alexander, was his short-lived reign. I mean, this conquest that happened so quickly and was over so quickly as far as his dominion, his reign, and yet this concept of Hellenism that he started and so militantly pushed on the world, it outlived him. I mean, by centuries and centuries and centuries. Pretty amazing. So the Ptolemies had been pretty tolerant. They were pretty tolerant. I don't know, I just put that together. Ptolemy is spelled with a P-T, and I just got this vision in my mind of Ptolemies being P-T-O-L-E. Anyway, sorry, I guess it wasn't that funny. Anyways, the Ptolemies had been pretty tolerant, but the Seleucids were determined to force the Jews to accept Hellenism, and they're just not even going to have a question about it. So Antiochus IV, that brings us to talk about him. He bore the surname Epiphanes, which means, does anybody remember this? Bob, do you remember? The illustrious. I think Miss Jan said it. The illustrious. Now, who named him that? Or did his subjects, his loyal subjects, name him that? No, he named himself that, of course. It was just, as Brother Cates would say, within a gnat's eyelash of calling himself a god. And so it was very, very offensive to especially the Jews. But he called himself Epiphanes, the illustrious. And it's funny because the Jews were so good at innuendo and things like that, and so they nicknamed him. And they would, I've read some sources that say they could pronounce it so, quickly and like a little bit of a flair to it that it would almost, like it just didn't get recognized by him or his soldiers or whatever. But what was their nickname for him? Epimanes. And so Antiochus Epiphanes, you can see where it's close, pretty close, and maybe they just say that so fast or something. I don't know. Maybe there's an accent they could put with it or something. But Epimanes means madman. The crazy one or something like that. So it's kind of funny. They nicknamed him that, and they would just call him that, and they were able to do that and get away with it because it was such a close twist on his self-titled illustrious, Antiochus the Illustrious. But he was born in Athens, of course, and served, again, as a hostage in Rome for a number of years. He learned to respect Rome, and he learned some politics while there as well. But Antiochus determined to civilize, in other words, to Hellenize the domain over which he ruled. I kind of agree, kind of disagree with Pfeiffer's statement. He makes a statement, it's possible to misrepresent Antiochus. I guess that's true, and he's not saying that to try to soften the blow of just what a crazy, cruel tyrant Antiochus was. But he's just saying, as he puts it, he was not a foreigner intent on enslaving a persecuted minority group. It's not like, this was not genocide. This is not like what Hitler did. I hate the Jews, they're inferior, and I'm going to just crush them. It's not that. And again, don't think I'm defending him in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But here's the thing. There were a decent amount of Jews who were impressed with Antiochus and the whole concept of being Hellenized. And it's kind of like, you see sometimes even today, somebody might say, some younger person, it may not even necessarily be a younger person, they say, man, we got these old-fashioned people, and they're stuck in their ways, and they've been doing things the same way for centuries, and we need to get with the program. And I mean, here comes Antiochus, and they're like, Hellenism sounds pretty cool. I mean, I kind of think that's kind of nice. Why not? Why can't we go and exercise and I mean, look, they bring in and build a gymnasium, and they play games, and they're in what's bad about going and getting some exercise and staying in shape and all these things that, that you can picture they might have said to defend this. And so there became a dissension, an inner dissension among the Jews, and Antiochus is going to use that to, to kind of interfere and meddle with the affairs, the internal affairs of Judea. And of course, Antiochus was not the best ruler just from a ruler's governmental standpoint. And so he's constantly short of money. So a lot of what he did was just pure greed, avarice, wanting money. And so he would do anything. He would play Jews against each other. He would go after this person, go after that person, betray this person, betray that person, just to get money. And I'm glad that's changed today, right, in history, and people don't do that anymore. The old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So understand that's kind of where Antiochus IV was coming from. In the early days of his reign, Jerusalem was ruled by the high priest. Again, this was kind of the beginnings of that change. Onios III at this point was a descendant of Simon the Just that I mentioned a moment ago. Onios III was strictly an Orthodox Jew. He's old school, we might say. And so the Jews who looked favorably on the Greek culture, they opposed him. And so they espoused the case, the cause of his brother Jason. He had a brother named Jason. And so what Jason does is he goes to Antiochus and he says, look, what does Onias pay for taxes, tribute? Well, whatever the number was, he says, well, what if I pay you more? Well, you remember what Antiochus' biggest problem was? He needed money. He was terrible at managing the financial affairs of government. And so Antiochus, the illustrious, as he titled himself, says, you pay me more tribute, it's yours, bro. You get the tribute together, you make sure it comes in on time, and you got the office. So guess who became high priest? Jason did. And of course the Jews didn't like that. But this is a brother of Onias, so it's still within the same family, which means it's within the same tribe, which means it's within the tribe of Levi. Now I say all that to say, just keep that in mind because it's coming. Eventually the tribe is going to change. And it ain't God changing it. And that's where Antiochus, he's going to cross the line with some of the old school, faithful Orthodox Jews. So Jason gets himself appointed high priest. Antiochus, he doesn't think twice about this. It's just a political office to him. As the Syrian king, he has that right. He can appoint whoever he wants in that office. That's kind of how he views it. But to the faithful Jews, the Orthodox Jews, the priesthood is of divine origin, and so it was under the law of Moses. And selling it to the highest bidder, that's a sin against the God of heaven. And they were upset. And the priesthood involves civil and religious duties, always under the law of Moses. So, as Pfeiffer points out, to both groups of Jews, whether you're a Hellenistic supporting Jew or whether you're an Orthodox Jew, the Hellenists are over here going, look, even under the law of Moses, it's a civil office. He's still in the tribe of Levi. What's the big deal? And so they're kind of defending it from the civil standpoint. The Orthodox Jews are over here going, this is somebody who leads in the sacrifice and the religious, spiritual leader of the nation, of the people. This is not right. And so, again, both sides are at odds, and Antiochus, he's happy to play them against each other and use it to however he can to get more money because he's always in need of money. Jason encouraged the Hellenists. They of course, helped him get elected, if you want to use that term, appointed by Antiochus. They built a gymnasium there in Jerusalem, and you even had some of the Jewish young men exercising in the nude, as was the custom with the Greeks. And you can imagine how that went over with Orthodox Jews. Greek names were often adopted in place of the traditional Jewish names. Hebrew orthodoxy was looked upon, as Pfeiffer puts it, as obscurantist and obsolete. It's like, you're one of those. You're stuck in the past. That's kind of the idea. Antiochus made a visit to Jerusalem in 170 BC, and he showed his approval of the new order, as Pfeiffer says, by authorizing citizens to call themselves Antiochites. Is that how you say that? I keep struggling with that word. Antioch, I guess, yeah, it'd be right. Antiochites? I don't know. Anyways, he wanted them to call themselves basically after him. But, of course, during this time, as you can imagine, among the faithful Jews, there develops a resistance. This becomes known, by the way, as what? Does anybody remember the term? The Hasidim or Hasidim. And they are the faithful. It means the pious, this word Hasidim or Hasidim. And these are the ones that the resistance that develops. By the way, do you know what group that we read about over and over and over again in the New Testament comes from the Hasidim? It's the Pharisees. And Zealots later on kind of developed from some of that too. But primarily Pharisees. We're going to read about a lot about them in the New Testament, of course. But this is kind of the beginnings of that faction within Judaism. So there's some people that rebel. And it's not necessarily outright rebellion at this point. Antiochus, he's having trouble elsewhere in his empire. And listen, if the Jews were pretty scandalized when Antiochus IV, the illustrious as he calls himself, takes Onios and replaces him with his brother Jason, they were upset about that, okay? But it went like next level when he then appointed a man named Menelaus, who was not even from the tribe of Levi. The Hasidim at that point said, we're taking this to the next level. We're going to start a rebellion. And of course, Jason didn't just give up without some kind of a fight. Antiochus is off dealing with issues in his empire, and Jason goes in and takes over again, winning back the high priesthood. And so there's infighting within the Jews, even in the midst of all this oppression from Antiochus. And so this is all going to kind of come to a fever pitch when Antiochus decides he's going to take over Egypt. Remember that conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids? Antiochus IV, the illustrious as he calls himself, he is going to take Egypt, but there's somebody standing in his way, and it's, of course, Rome. And we'll talk about how that falls out next week. And then what we'll do next week is we'll sum up the last part of Antiochus IV's reign. Then we'll take a break like we did after the Persian Empire, and we'll talk about what's going on with the Jews during this time. You ever wonder where the Septuagint came from? Do you ever wonder about the influence of Alexandria and Antioch on interpretation of the Bible and things like that? We'll talk about some of that next week after we wrap up Antiochus IV. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before our worship hour this morning.